Greetings and welcome back to another episode of the Daily Run, and today we're playing as Eden. This has to be the most abysmal start to a daily run I've ever seen. I don't think even the one where we started out with Cursed Eye and Bob's Brain was worse. I think this one has to be the contender for just the worst start of a daily ever. Luckily it does turn out to be a bit better, but look at the stats. 14 tier delay, which is 4 above average, and we also have 2.5 damage, which is 1 damage below the average base damage that Isaac has, and you don't even know how hurtful that is. It just hurts my very soul that I have to play in a condition like this, or just that we had this daily, because I think it brings so many different connotations with it. And what you really have to realize here is that the game is balanced around enemies having a certain amount of health and you having 3.5 damage as your base damage. Obviously some characters have less, some have more, but the overall premise of the game is balanced around that base stats. And the reason for that is that even though you have this tangible number of damage that you're doing to enemies, they have a very discrete number of health. So if an enemy has 10 health, it doesn't matter if you have 3.5 damage or if you have more or less. What's important is in how many hits you can kill that enemy. And in most cases, most enemies are balanced so you can kill them in 2 or 3 hits. But once suddenly that same enemy takes 3 hits to kill, or maybe even 4 in some cases, it becomes this game where you're trying to both avoid and kill enemies at the same time. And of course, if you can kill them in 2 hits, it's much easier to circumvent some rooms than if you have to kill them in 3 hits. And especially with certain items that we also have, like Bob's Brain, you can imagine just how hard and difficult it is not to walk into enemies accidentally. And the whole balance of the game is shown on its head, and there's really nothing much you can do about it other than just get really good and really try to predict where the enemies are going. Of course, this is more problematic with enemies which move randomly, so maybe more like spiders, but even with other enemies it does tend to be quite a bit of a problem. But still, we did persevere, and thankfully at least we had the hourglass to kind of help us with that situation. And you might say the hourglass isn't that like one of the worst items in the game. It is, but at least thankfully in this situation where we don't have enough damage, we can use it as some sort of a defense mechanism. We activate it and then suddenly we're just much better at dodging and avoiding enemies, so that we can actually start and hitting and dealing some damage and not really worry about the walking to enemies accidentally. And I think that in this niche case scenario, obviously the hourglass was not the best active item we could have gotten, probably wasn't even that good, but at least it was helpful to some degree, and I'm really glad that we got to see some of the positive benefits of the hourglass. Oftentimes it's just overlooked, and even though it was only used for like the first 2 floors or first 3 when I replaced it with Mega Blast, at least it does prove that there are some niche cases for every single item in the game and that we should love them, except maybe Butterbean. But Butterbean is more of a trolley item, doesn't really do much. But with the hourglass, I think that with 2 charges, it is a contender for an item that can be useful sometimes. And I'm always glad whenever we can start out as playing as Eden with items that we generally don't really take because they tend to be better, because we always have a better spacebar item. But in this case, it did turn out to be quite fun, or at least quite good. The other item that we started out with is not my favorite, and that's the Nightlight. And I know a lot of people love this item. It's great, don't get me wrong. It's nice to have a slow on demand, essentially, and it's essentially also an infinite slow, which should mean that you shouldn't have a problem by dealing with enemies. And if you can shine your light into the enemy's face and still shoot and dodge, that's usually the best case scenario. And what you really can do with this is not be in any danger at all if you know how to use it. But the problem is that it's tied to your movement and not to your shooting, which makes it a bit awkward to use. And what ends up happening sometimes is that you might slow temporarily some enemies or some shots, and other times you won't really be doing that, which will create this unpredictable pattern. I think this is maybe more apparent with bullet hell enemies than just regular enemies, but it can definitely happen. And for that reason, I just don't really like this item, because it does make some things unpredictable, even though it has a nice neat effect. I really like the concept. The idea is, I think, very fitting for an Isaac game, and it's also thematically fitting, and also as an item I think is really strong. It's one of those items which really shines, that's a pun, wasn't intended, but let's say that it was, that shines through whenever you know how to use it. And I really liked items like that, because I know a lot of people really like this item, but then again, I know a lot of people who really dislike it. So, for example, me, because I can't use it, I don't know how to use it, and I never really learned, and I never forced myself to use it. And I think my opinion would change if I just got this item more frequently, and when you get the item more frequently, I think that's when it results in you just getting adapted to it and getting adjusted to it, to really try to eke out every single positive aspect of the run you have to try to achieve the victory in the end. But with how it is, I just find it a mild annoyance. It's not that big of a deal. I'm just making it out to be maybe like it's a bigger deal than it actually is. It's not, obviously. I don't think it hurt me or even caused me one hit of damage in this whole run, except for maybe me missing because it's bright and maybe the contrast is a bit too big. But at least what's really great about it is if you do get a Curse of Darkness, at least you can see what's going on. So maybe this is my unkryptonite. You know how much I hate the Curse of Darkness, so having the nightlight in that situation makes everything a little bit brighter, and maybe I like it for that reason. You know what? After thinking about it, I think I like this item. I just changed my stance in 2 minutes flat, saying I don't like it, and now I like it. Let's say I like it because it does offset the Curse of Darkness, and I really wish there would be more items which would affect or play with the Lightning of Isaac, but sadly they really aren't. And I was actually wondering when I got the Curse of Darkness on this run why it was so bright, but I think Nightlight was exactly the reason. That's actually very interesting to note. I never really thought about it, but I guess it does help. So, after we got a bit into the run, even though it was very weak at the beginning, and even with these abysmal items, we did manage to get Mega Blast. And if you actually paid attention or played the daily yourself, I don't think I've ever experienced an item like Mega Blast being so weak. I felt like I had to literally put it on the enemy for like 3 or 4 seconds before it even managed to kill it. And I think I could manage to clear like maybe 4 or maybe 5 rooms at maximum. And that's obviously quite bad because you want to, let's say, generally do something like 8 or 9 so you can really start charging it up again and just use it as fast as you can and possibly try to kill the boss as well with it. But in this case where we really didn't have a lot of damage, or where we basically didn't have any damage, I was stuck in a position where I really couldn't use it very effectively. Obviously, I still stuck with it because later on I did get Dark Judas and some other items which helped me both to regenerate it by getting a lot of battery charges from the sack. So we had a sack of sacks and Sackboy, but we also get an ability to not to hold, but yeah, I mean to hold 2 runes, and that might not seem very useful as to why I'm trying to say that that's good with Mega Blast. It's not super good with Mega Blast, but I'm just kind of saying what's going on in the run. But what I meant to say is that because we had this ability, we also got Dark Judas, that means more damage. We also had a lot of battery charges. It just makes the item a lot more usable, and after you're actually done with everything, you can go back and then pick up the sacks on the floor and get more batteries, and because of that, it does allow you for a much more dynamic scenario where you can really use the Mega Blast in a lot of different situations. So you saw me just use it against Mom here because I didn't really want to bother by fighting her, and there was also this anti-synergy, which I like to call it, as having Bob's Brain and Mr. Mega, which just makes it so that your Bob's Brain has a much larger effect radius than it has any right to be, and then it just ends up damaging you more often than it really should. And it's one of those things where I feel like if I knew about it, I wouldn't have picked up Bob's Brain before, but obviously I was in a situation where I felt like my run is going very badly, so I just felt like I needed a bit of oomph, a little bit of damage to actually deal with enemies in the rooms, and I thought that Bob's Brain is a bright choice in that case, but later on I did realize that it was a mistake. Obviously I could have known that, so in the moment when I made the decision it wasn't a mistake, so I think that's what's important here. You should never look on your run in retrospect and say, oh yeah, that was a mistake because of that, but obviously with different information that you had about the run, it maybe wasn't a mistake. You should always gauge your reaction or your decisions based on the point of the run where you're making that decision, because if you do it later or prior to that, you really don't have a full clear picture of what you're trying to achieve. So once we got through that, we got Mega Blast. Luckily we got Dark Judas, so we got enough damage, and we got one of the best trinkets in the game, Cracked Tron. I never really talked about it, but essentially what it does is every single stats up that happened to your run so far, it just increments it and adds a little bit more on top of that, and it's just one of these top tier items which essentially serves as a trinket which gives you both damage and DPS and speed, and it just gets better the more damage and other sources of speed and variety that you got, and it's so good because it's essentially a temporary stats up which can be permanent, so you're not locked to it. If you find a better trinket or if you find a way to break the game with it, you can always drop it down, or maybe you can clear the whole floor with it, then you can pick up a different trinket, break the game, and then keep it again for the next floor. And it's just one of those trinkets which I feel more trinkets should be like. I know that I don't mean overpowered, because I do feel like it's a bit overpowered, not overpowered, but it's much stronger than most of the other trinkets, but I feel like more trinkets should fill this niche role. Obviously some of them do just act up as stats up, but I don't feel like just adding 2 damage on top of that is a very interesting effect, but once you combine it with multiple stats, and it depends on how many other stats up you've gotten, I think it creates this interesting dynamic where you have a trinket which is most often, or at least in most cases, it can be very good, but you're not tied to it. It's something you want to keep, but you don't necessarily have to if you don't want to, and I really like that concept. Obviously that's true for every trinket, because just due to nature of the fact that they're droppable and you can drop them on the ground, but really there are trinkets which you pick up and you drop and you can even leave behind and you would never feel bad about it. So once you have this dependency on the trinket to actually give you damage, I feel like it becomes much more important. It just gains value in some regard, and maybe that's really what I want from trinkets, to be stronger overall, and maybe that would break the balance of the game. But then again, if Afterbirth Plus didn't break the balance of the game, I don't think at this point any changes to trinkets can really mess up what's going on. But with all that said, we did get this trinket, we did get a bunch of crazy items, and just because I did persevere through the run, I feel like I was rewarded at the end. So I got all of the right items that allowed me to break the game essentially, and I broke it not for the reason because I wanted to get a really high score. Obviously that's also what I'm gunning for, but more for the reason that this run really dicked us in the butt, and I hated it. I hate the fact that whenever you start a run and it's just terrible and then it gets better, because I feel like this is a way of the games telling you that you're not good enough, and it's like putting you on the spot and saying, now yeah, you got this, now deal with it. And obviously that's not something that I think anybody enjoys, but especially not me, because I feel like the game is trying to prove itself to me in some regard. And then what I do is I try to break the game, and intentionally I went out of my way to actually get as strong of a run as possible without maybe being too boring. And just get really powerful. And even though I did say that I just broke like 3 days before, and I broke for 3 days in a row with pretty much the same method, I kept doing the same thing in this particular round. So I just spawned a bunch of judgments in the secret room, I rerolled it until I got a forget me now. I even got blank card, because in the secret room there's only 19 items and some of those are blank cards and forget me nows, and it's very easy to actually force those items. Sadly I didn't get a Yara rune, so I didn't get that an additional 5,000 or 6,000 points which I could have gotten, but that's maybe my mistake because I didn't keep it. But then again, I did try to break it prior to that, so maybe again there was something else we could have done here. It was just a lucky streak of coincidences, and I didn't feel like it was right for me to tell this run to that I won't do it, because it had 2 5-pip dice rooms. It didn't give me any way to actually get going early on, except I guess Mega Blast is the ultimate way of the game telling you, here you go, maybe you deserve this. But still, those 2 first floors were highness, and I just couldn't handle it at the point. But nevertheless, we did finish, and we did come to the end, and it all went well, it all went happily. This was a bit more of a disjointed commentary than I usually do, and the main reason for that is I guess I'm feeling a little bit silly today, just playing through this daily, going through 5-pip dice rooms, doing the 3rd floor 3 times in total, then going to the shoal with Awa's runes, and then doing it again with the forget me now. It's just also very repetitive, so I guess I'm just trying to introduce a bit of dynamic feelings of how I actually felt while I played the run. It was one of those runs which felt very trolly to me, and I guess sometimes it just feels good to break the game and just tell it to screw off and just leave you alone, because you can't deal with its bullshit anymore. And I hope that I achieved that to some extent. We did come to the end, finally, and I pick up the trophy, and we did beat everything that we had to beat. Obviously our damage penalty is extremely high because I can't handle Bob's Brain and Mr. Mega. I found that is literally my kryptonite. Not literally, it is my kryptonite, and it's just, I hate that combo because it does end up damaging us so much, and you can see that it's reflected in the damage penalty. But also all of the other penalties are also quite high. Time penalty is quite high. I played for 2 hours. I picked up a ton of items. Obviously they were all premium grade items, but at least it did allow me to get pretty strong. And maybe the coup de grace, the best part of this run, is just our naturally high exploration bonus, because we did 3 extra floors as to what you would usually do if you just go to Shoal. But remember that this was a run that went to Mom, so we actually did not only 3 extra floors, but we did I think 5 or maybe even 6 extra floors on top of what we were supposed to do. So it was just this cluster of more rooms, more items, more things to do, and in the end I think it turned out pretty well. It did turn out to be a pretty enjoyable run. It was one of those brainless runs where you just go from room to room just killing enemies with Mega Blast, or with spiders, or with flies, or with sides coming from your head in 4 directions, and all of that is pretty fun, but it's not really fun, engaging. It's fun, but it's not engaging, it's not challenging, I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Without blabbering too much, I hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and I hope to see you next time.